My name is Greg Remke, and this is a presentation from Liberty International that I gave in Madrid at their annual conference August 19th, Feeding and Fasting, the Vast Diversity Within, and Nutrition Against Disease. Nutrition Against Disease is the title of a popular book by Dr. Roger Williams, University of Texas biochemist. Went through 6 printings, and I'm going to draw from that and more recent research, some that I've done in a study for the Goodman Institute, Did the Government Make Us Fat? And drawing much of my research from recent writers on nutrition, science researchers, Nina Teicholz with her book, The Big Fat Surprise, Gary Taubes with Good Calories, Bad Calories, and The Case for Keto. Also, the movie Fat Fiction I'd recommend. I've been posting at normalnutrition.substack.com. Mostly I do research on the economics of high school and homeschool speech and debate students, and I've been advocating that a debate topic on reforming the federal dietary guidelines would be beneficial for students understanding the science and the history, and also for people to improve their own health, as poor health is a big challenge in the United States and in Europe. So I'm going to draw from Dr. Roger Williams. His textbook, Biochemical Individuality, is still in print. He has other books, Free and Unequal, reprinted by the Liberty Fund, although now out of print. Nutrition in a Nutshell, and You Are Extraordinary. Through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, his books sold widely on making the case that we could improve our health through better nutrition, better deal with alcoholism and various chronic diseases through diet. This was eclipsed through a series, I would argue, of accidents and ideology and poor federal policy, but that's the subject of my presentation. The subtitle of Dr. Williams' textbook, Keys to Understanding What Shapes Your Health, and a description below, a timeless classic that links the diversity of our anatomy and body chemistry with our unique nutritional needs. Often libertarians or free market people call for individualism, say we're all individuals, but this is beyond that, saying that we're all biochemically individual. We're so different inside. Our minds work different, our bodies work different, they look different, and this is partly why we are in poor health. We're all treated as if we're the same, and you could argue there are political implications as well. Now, why take time to discuss all this with a group of market-oriented people attending this Liberty International Conference? Well, we want societies of free and thriving individuals living in healthy communities. But we can't have healthy communities without healthy people. And I would argue that a specter of poor metabolic health is haunting Europe, the United States, and the world. And we can, by learning about nutrition and dietary requirements, we can improve ourselves and make ourselves ready for healthier societies. So I mentioned sort of the core thing I'm drawing from is Dr. Williams' book, Nutrition Against Disease. And you can see the publishing history here, from the hardback in 72 to the paperback in 73, and 10 printings through 1982. So a ton of people read this book and were influenced by it, but this knowledge disappeared. My copy is sort of yellowed because it's out of print, but I've reprinted some of the titles here. The flaw in medical education: they don't teach nutrition. Poor nutrition is the source of most chronic conditions, yet it's not taught in medical schools. Instead, the focus is on prescribing medications and surgery and other issues to deal with the symptoms of chronic condition. But if the source is poor nutrition, we've got a problem. Dr. Williams talks about other issues: a new hope for better health, protecting hearts, and this is a big part of the story we have to tell of the heart attacks that became a part of the federal dietary guidelines in the 50s and 60s. Protecting the hearts we have, What's the cause of cardiovascular disease? Is it eating saturated fats or is it something else? And then he has a chapter on the fight against obesity. Being overweight and obesity is far worse now than it was when Dr. Williams was writing in the 60s and 70s. Also, dental disease is a big part of this, again linked to nutrition. Autoimmune diseases like arthritis are discussed, and longevity, how we can delay old age with better nutrition, and environmental control of mental disease. I talk much about this with the Metabolic Mind website and Chris Palmer's recent book, Brain Energy. And then the battle against alcoholism, again related to nutrition. Again, this is written 50 some years ago, but somehow all these ideas were eclipsed, were lost. And this is the man who did it, Ancel Keys. Ancel Keys made the case that the epidemic of heart attacks that was attacking Americans, including our president, Dwight Eisenhower at the time, who had a heart attack, he said it was caused by eating saturated fat from red meat, and that was the problem. Pure, White, and Deadly was a counter view by John Yudkin saying that no, it was sugar, not saturated fat. And, there's more to this story, but it turns out that part of the argument for that seemed to implicate saturated fat was actually funded by the sugar industry. The Sugar Foundation paid researchers to shift the blame to red meat and saturated fat for the heart disease, when in fact much data showed that sugar was the problem, or the overuse of sugar. So to say that sugar is a poison to some extent is misleading. Lots of things are poisons. Poisons is in the dose. So a modest amount of sugar as a sweetener is not, not deadly, but Americans vastly increased their consumption of sugar, as did people in the United Kingdom through the Industrial Revolution. And the argument is this caused much of our problem. But again, the blame was switched to the meat industry, and that led to the federal dietary guidelines and the whole low-fat push. And I guess the tobacco industry is cheering on both sugar and meat industry attacking each other. And Dwight Eisenhower, by the way, was smoking like 4 packs of cigarettes a day while he was on World War II, and that could have most likely contributed significantly to his heart disease. There's a broader sort of history here of how the anti-meat views that sort of erupted in the 60s, 70s, 80s and led to the federal dietary guidelines had their start earlier on with various Christian sects like the Seventh-day Adventists, as well as leftist ideology that sort of claimed that vegetables and vegetables were a better way to see the world. The rise of vegetarianism, veganism, were basically, it's like we think it's new, but it's not. It's part of the deep historical roots of the political left from the time of the French Revolution, sweeping Europe, the idea of ethical vegetarianism. You're going to fight against the big government and big meat, I guess, by being less violent, just having plants instead of killing animals. So it's been a part of left-wing ideology and activism and identity for well over a century. And feminists, suffragettes, particularly those that are socialist, rejected the violence of what they saw as an unjust social order and the patriarchy itself, and they advocated vegetarianism. And this wasn't just the left. This was part of a broader religious ideology, and you can see this with the, and by the way, I'd argue that the left-wing ideology, it wasn't that the left-wing ideology leads to veganism and vegetarianism, but the opposite, that eating plants and vegetables tends to shift someone toward left-wing ideology. That's a claim, and I hope I'll make more arguments for it later on. So part of this is the theme here is the progressive era was an effort to shift society to try and be scientific, with eugenics and other sorts of things to improve society. Prohibition as a public health measure to stop people from drinking so that they'd have more discipline and control. And then part of this was the Body Project, where you could do calorie counting and discipline the stomach, and elite women could become thinner and more elegant and separate themselves from the heavier working women, everyday working women, by eating vegetables and plants and not eating meat. So this is a discussion of this in a publication on the Progressive Era Body Project, and talks about the popularity of calorie counting through national magazines that started this craze of women trying to lose weight by counting calories. And I would argue counting calories is part of the current federal dietary guideline or public health views that calories in, calories out. People are overweight because they consume too many calories and don't exercise enough. The alternate view, which I'll come to, is to say, no, it's the carbohydrate insulin model. It's a hormonal or metabolic disorder that leads to poor health, chronic conditions, and obesity. That obesity and being overweight is a consequence of poor metabolic health, not a cause. So again, more in this article that's available. You can search it online. The book by Lilu Hunt Peters, who's the key person, Diet and Health. The key to the calories. You've got to count the calories to get healthy, to watch your weight. And these women that may have been and were normal weight by historical standards, judging by the paintings in the past and who we thought was healthy, suddenly were considered overweight, and you needed to be skinny and light to be the elite modern view and count your calories. But of course, that didn't work then. It doesn't work now. Interestingly, the same author later wrote a book that's different, but is arguing that the obesity and diabetes in urban America is partly a consequence of federal policies. The Small Business Administration had policies after the Watts riot and the destruction of inner cities to fund fast food restaurants, fund franchises. So funding for McDonald's, Burger King, Subway, thousands and thousands of fast food restaurants in the inner city funded by the federal government. They were franchises where African Americans could own the franchise, but the big corporation, of course, was behind it. But these policies wouldn't fund grocery stores. The grocery stores didn't qualify because they weren't franchises, and they had larger volumes but smaller profits, and the volumes of a grocery store meant they didn't qualify for these SBA loans. So the banks wouldn't loan without the government support. All of a sudden, the inner cities are flooded with fast food restaurants rather than regular grocery stores where African Americans could buy the food and cook their traditional, much more healthy meals. So interesting history here as well. Unintended consequences. Back to the religious origins of the federal dietary guidelines. The American Dietitians Association was formed in 1917, and the founder of this was a protege of John Harvey Kellogg. And the Kellogg's were part of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Battle Creek, Michigan. The church, one of many churches, and James Graham is involved in these religious Christian views of not eating meat. The Seventh-day Adventists felt that meat caused lust in men and needed to be avoided, and they were part of this healthy food movement. And so the Kellogg's invented, the breakfast cereal, the cornflakes, sort of by accident, very entrepreneurial, but nationwide were pushing to replace, eggs and bacon and cream and fat for breakfast with low-fat, high-carb breakfast cereals. And this spread in the United States to Australia, around the world, as part of the Dietitians Association. And the same thing as today. The dietitians, nutritionists are still promoting low-fat meals, the Seventh-day Adventist diet with fruits and vegetables, maybe pea protein or lean protein, but mostly the Garden of Eden diet without meat. Now, this whole history is discussed in various historical research, but also Belinda Fettke gives a nice overview of this, the evolution of the plant-based diet from its original roots in the Seventh-day Adventist Church and other religious enthusiasms of the early 19th century. It's a blending of religion, science, philosophy, and politics to establish the claimed scientific or pseudoscientific basis for vegetarianism. And again, this comes from influence of Eastern religion and Hinduism and so forth as well. So, fast forwarding decades, we have the federal dietary guidelines that were passed in the 1980s. And again, this is a response of a consequence of Ancel Keys, who I had listed earlier. And he was arguing that saturated fats were clogging our arteries, and he pushed the McGovern Commission to pass the low-fat federal dietary guidelines in '77. But again, as an earlier overhead said, John Yetkin and others testified that there wasn't enough data to support a nationwide experiment in low fat. I mean, saturated fat had been part of the human diet for millennium, and for most of the Bible and the Greeks and Romans and so forth, and suddenly they want to eat vegetables. What's that about? When the claim was made that there wasn't enough research for this novel vegetable diet, the response by McGovern was, we don't have time for more data. People are dying. And this was an epidemic of heart disease in the 50s and 60s, including Dwight Eisenhower. And suddenly the dietary guidelines were passed, and that was the end of the story. We had the food pyramid. We had lectures in every high school and middle school where often the football coach would be teaching the nutrition class and talking about why it's important to have lots of meals of whole grains and veggies and fruits, eat many times, small meals, don't eat fat, don't eat saturated fat, don't eat eggs because they reduce cholesterol. But this progressive era sort of fad of calorie counting and low fat, critics say, led to this epidemic of chronic health problems in the US, obesity and diabetes. This comes out with Gary Taubes in a New York Times Magazine article, What If It's All Been a Big Fat Lie? His book, Good Calories and Bad Calories, looks at the whole controversial claims about fats, carbs, and diet and health. This was in 2008. Nina Teicholz's book, The Big Fat Surprise, Why Butter, Meat, and Cheese Belong in a Healthy Diet. Both Taubes and Teicholz are science journalists. They write articles on science, and they got into researching nutrition, and both were shocked at what they found, the incredible poor quality of the scientific research, the epidemiological research, and claims of lack of randomized control trials. And they make this case in their books and in videos. Gary Taubes' later book, The Case for Keto, Nina Teicholz spearheading the Nutrition Coalition, gathering more research and saying, we revise these federal dietary guidelines every 5 years, but they're still based on these low-fat claims, even though low fat isn't in the language anymore, but they're not based on current evidence that shows that people live longer when they're eating meat instead of plants, that there's no correlation between reducing saturated fats or reducing cholesterol and living longer. These are claims that were made, but they're not backed by science. So again, we got into this mess for a variety of accidental reasons in history, but now we have the knowledge, the research. We should be able to escape this, reform the federal dietary guidelines, and return to healthy diets. Our grandparents ate traditional foods, preserved with fermentation and pickling, cooked with healthy fats like beef tallow, in recipes handed down over generations. And our ancestors, not only did they eat more saturated fat and more meat and healthy fats, but they also fasted. They went long periods of time without eating, by choice for religious reasons or by necessity during winter when food was scarce. And, they feasted on feast days and ate a whole lot. And the argument here is that our bodies are designed or adapted for both fasting and feasting. We can go a long time without eating, although we're not, conditioned for it now because we keep snacking all day long because that's what the government, tells us to do. But our metabolic systems are adapted to gain a lot of weight in the fall right? When the fruit is ripe, when the grain is harvested, when there's plenty of food, we're designed to eat a lot, to have our feast days and gain weight, and turn quickly to fat. And then through the winter, as there's less, run out of vegetables, we go to our canned food, we have, pickled herring and other salted fish, but it's protein and not much carbs, and we're designed to go into ketosis, where our body, without carbohydrates, naturally starts burning the fat from our fat stores, and we lose weight. We get healthier in a sense through fasting, through burning our own body fat. We lose weight. We hope to have gained enough fat in the fall to survive through winter, and maybe through spring if there's a tough winter or bad harvest. But in the modern world, this goes against us, right? It's always October in the grocery store. There's always fruit and vegetables and carbs, processed food in the grocery store. So it's natural to gain weight through the adjustment that their body has that was originally designed to get us through periods of time without food. So the good news is we can learn to fast. It's not complicated. It's incredibly healthy, triggering autophagy and all sorts of metabolic benefits. Again, it sounds crazy. I mean, when I was in college, I read Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse, and the Buddha in there says, I can think, I can fast, I can wait. And I thought I could think, I could wait, but the idea of fasting was crazy. How, a young man, how could I go a day or 2 days without eating? But it turns out that your body can, and you can feel great doing it. Again, do your own research. But our bodies were designed, again, to gain weight when there's lots of food, to lose weight when there isn't. But the public health authorities, not recognizing this or believing this, are giving us bad advice about what to eat and when to eat. And in consequence, we're eating the wrong foods, gaining vast amounts of weight, and becoming chronically unhealthy. So 50 years of government and public health authorities pushing and funding low-fat food, and now we're unhealthier. We live longer, or did until recently, but with more chronic health conditions, from cardiovascular disease, obesity, diabetes, cancer, autoimmune, and even mental health disorders. What I'm suggesting and what my Normal Nutrition website discusses, it's nothing radical. Nina Teicholz says, before the federal government's push for reducing fat, people naturally ate about 60% of their calories from fat, and 30% from carbs, and the rest from protein. And what happened with the dietary guidelines is we pushed down the fat as we switched from eggs to egg whites, or from butter to margarine, whole fat and cream to reduced fat or skim milk. But this is a mistake, and there's a long history. The Atkins diet that was popular in the 2000s and is regaining popularity, it wasn't unusual. Gary Taubes writes in The Case for Keto that Herman Thaler's 1961 book, Calories Don't Count, it sold 2 million copies. This is in the 60s, again, the time that Dr. Williams' books are popular. Thaler learns this diet from Alfred Pennington, who was a doctor for DuPont. Pennington learned it from Blake Donaldson, a cardiology who'd worked since the 1920s. And these ideas, it comes the Banting diet in the 1860s. If you wanted to lose weight, you just ate less starches. You stopped eating potatoes. You stopped eating rice and pasta and bread, and you lost weight. This was standard, understood knowledge, but it was buried by this later infatuation with the fear of saturated fat. So again, standard recommendations for obesity in Europe in the 1800s, 1900s, and that's why, Americans weren't obese. When I was in high school, there was a couple people that were overweight, very few, very different than today, because people were eating different food. They had bacon and eggs for breakfast, not breakfast cereal. So, again, a little of the science behind this. Gary Taubes writes on this in an article in Clinical Nutrition by David Ludwig of Harvard, says, here's more on this. To attribute obesity to overeating is as meaningful as to attribute alcoholism to overdrinking. Instead, there's something else going on. There's a hormonal imbalance. It's not the energy balance theory, which is what public health officials continue to propose, calories in, calories out. Instead, it's a metabolic disorder. Some people have trouble metabolizing carbohydrates. Gary Taubes mentioned this himself. He was an athlete in high school, was fit, and then he got heavy. That's what happened to me. I was an athlete. I gradually gained weight. My father was very fit and lean. He gradually gained weight. We had a propensity to obesity. Our bodies could not properly metabolize carbohydrates, which wouldn't have been a problem if we'd eaten bacon and eggs and the same amount of carbs that, our parents or others ate. Instead, my dad switched, and I did, oatmeal and blueberries for breakfast, a sandwich with a big thing of bread for lunch, basically not eating much meat and cutting back on fat. And that didn't work for my metabolism. I gained weight, I got obese doing that until I read about this stuff. Of course, I ate a lot of cookies too, and my dad ate a lot of pastries, potato chips. That was part of the problem. But the leading scholars in leading universities, David Ludwig at Harvard, Eric Westman at Duke, Mark Hyman at the Cleveland Clinic, Stephen Finney at Virta Health, and others, have recognized that our epidemic of chronic disease is more tied to excess consumption of carbohydrates. And instead, people are getting all sorts of pills, medications, injected insulin. Half of recent diabetics can put diabetes in remission by cutting carbohydrates. Dr. Unwin just published research on this. They've had something like 80% improvement in handling blood glucose abnormalities just by cutting carbohydrates. So I write on this. You can look at the data, the research, but unfortunately, the federal government still is pushing back on this, and most doctors and healthcare providers will not suggest cutting carbs as a way to get healthy. It's crazy, I would argue. So, so there's millions of dollars in funding supporting more medication or new pills to lose weight, when in fact dietary changes that aren't hard to make for most people can have that successful result. So there's more to read on this, and books that I think are great. Nutrition in Crisis by Richard Feynman's one of the best. His rule number 1, if you're healthy, you're healthy. Rule number 2, if you want to lose weight, don't eat. If you have to eat, don't eat carbs. It's not complicated. Rule 3, for diabetes and metabolic syndrome, carbohydrate restriction should be the default approach. That is the one you try first. If that doesn't work, okay, there's medications to try. But at first, just cut carbs. Again, today's metabolic problems, they helped our ancestors survive. That's why we're here. They gained weight fast in October to survive the winter. We're fit during famines. Jay Richards' book, Eat Fast Feast, is highly recommended. I argue, get a scale that can measure your body fat. You should be reducing your visceral fat. I post on this online. There's lots of exciting things to learn. There's more to the story. Our gut microbiome, Ed Young's I Contain Multitudes, talks about the huge impact of the microbes. The Sonnenbergs at Stanford write on the role of the gut in controlling weight and mood and long-term health. And Tim Spector writes on this as well. Now, the Sonnenbergs and Spector are plant-based people. They say eat, mostly plants. There's a lot to disagree with that, but it is important to understand about the role of your gut microbiome in your health and your mood. So, what feeds the microbiome? Well, it's what you eat. If you're snacking regularly on heavily processed and high sugar food, you're feeding the wrong microbes, and the argument is that's making you sick. Chris Palmer's book, Brain Energy, and the Metabolic Mind website are looking at the role of diet in mental health. Eating excess carbohydrates or trying to go vegan, your brain is not getting the nutrition it needs unless you're supplementing and very, very careful. Georgia Ede talks about this as well, and you can see on her website the importance of a proper diet for mental health. And again, we're all different. I didn't include much of the Roger Williams discussion of how different we are, but our diet has a big impact on our mental health as well as our physical health. And again, I recommend Nina Teicholz in her presentation at the Cato Institute, which is what got me started in realizing my diet was contributing to my obesity and prediabetes. Nina was introduced by Terence Keeley, who himself was shocked to find that he had type 2 diabetes when he thought he was eating healthy. And it turned out that breakfast cereals and following the federal guidelines in the United Kingdom were making him sick, and he writes about that in his book. You can watch Nina Teicholz's presentation online, and she also speaks for many other Low Carb Down Under and CrossFit Health and others. More research on this, highly recommended. Thank you, and wishing you a long and healthy and metabolically flourishing life.